Hi everybody, Peggy McGuire here for English 104 Technical Writing. And today we're going to talk about once you have done technical research and you have prepared a report based on that research, situations in which you need to make oral presentations of the research that you've done and the findings that you've come up with. So today we talk about oral presentations. And we're going to talk about these presentations both in terms of how you plan for them and then how you deliver them. So always the first thing we ask ourselves is, why are we doing this? Why are we presenting this information orally? And the speaker's purpose is always some combination of needing to inform an audience and or instruct an audience and or persuade an audience about some important piece of information. So it's some or all of the above that you're trying to accomplish when you're making an oral presentation of your written technical research findings. Now, there are a lot of advantages to being able to present this information orally. The biggest of which is that you immediately are creating an interactive context. So it is possible to work with your audience to best present and get across your information. So you can do things like use eye contact, use body language of various kinds, gestures, use a particular tone of voice so that you can more directly connect with your audience in a way that you have no access to when someone is reading what you wrote. And if the speaker has a personality that shines through, that personality can actually increase the receptiveness of your audience to your message. One of the important things, although this takes time and experience, a speaker can actually adjust a presentation based on how the audience is responding to it. So that really takes thinking on your feet, but it's also something that you can never do when someone is reading what you wrote. You cannot then jump in and say, let me change that based on how you're responding to it. So it's a real nice advantage, but one that takes experience and skill on the part of the speaker. And finally, speakers can provide immediate answers to audience questions. Once the audience asks them, you can immediately give feedback. Again, if I am reading someone's research report and I start having questions, I don't have the person right there in front of me to ask the questions to. So you can provide a valuable service as a speaker in terms of immediately providing answers to the questions that audiences might have. However, there are also some clear disadvantages to oral presentation of this kind of information. And the big one is you have one chance to get it right. You are there, your audience is ready, you deliver the information, they're listening. That's your chance, your one chance to get it right. So that kind of thing can feel like a lot of pressure. And pressure can cause us to make mistakes. So we need to plan carefully how we're going to do the presentation to minimize the pressure on ourselves as the speakers. So for instance, as I'm planning my presentation, I want to limit the amount of information and the complexity of information that I'm presenting. If I don't do that, my mistakes will be magnified and I could risk losing or, heaven forbid, boring my audience. And you know, a speaker can tell when the audience is leaving. So planning carefully, part of planning carefully is limiting how much info, how complex the info that I'm going to present. And it could be all the work you've done may get boiled down into this one event, and you may get judged for it, even though if you make some mistakes, it doesn't really fairly represent everything that you've done. That's what the listeners get to hear, and if you make mistakes, that's what they're going to judge you on. So it's a tough environment. It has its disadvantages. So again, how do we minimize the possibility of those disadvantages so we can focus on the positive and the strengths of being able to do an oral presentation of technical materials? Again, we keep coming back to purpose and audience, don't we? Get to know your audience as much as possible before you do an oral presentation. Find out who you're speaking to and what roles they play within an organization, if they are representing an organization, or whatever body of people they are. Who are they? What kinds of roles are they playing with each other and in the company? Get to know who you're speaking to. If possible, get to know what their most likely attitudes or experiences would be related to the topic you're presenting on. What might they be most concerned about? This should sound familiar. When we talk about audience, think about what questions they might have. What might their concerns be? Same thing with oral presentations. Get to know, if possible, what attitudes and experiences your audience is bringing to that presentation and what kinds of questions they might ask. And of course, always, you want to find out if there are, among the people you're speaking to, any differences in cultural or linguistic backgrounds that you need to pay attention to as a responsible speaker. So, are there any ways that they would expect something different than what you would normally do? Um, Especially with language differences and cultural differences. So, you need to pay attention to that. All right, so those are the sort of advantages and disadvantages writ large. Now, let's talk about how you plan an oral presentation. Always be clear yourself about your purpose. What are you there for? Are you there to inform listeners? Are you there to teach them something? Are you there to persuade them to do something or believe something? What's your purpose as a speaker? What do you want your audience to come away with? What do you want them to think? What do you want them to know after you speak? What do you want them to do after you speak? And always, how will you handle their concerns or objections? So you're thinking about that long before you actually decide what you're going to say. These questions help you decide what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. Not only do you need to know something about the audience, but also what we call the speaking situation, the context in which you are going to do your oral presentation. For instance, how much time do I have to prepare? How much time do I actually have to speak? Will there be other people speaking? Will I be speaking first? Will I be speaking last? Will others be speaking before or after me? How formal or informal is the setting in which I'm going to speak? How much can I use more familiar language? How much do I have to sort of be on my toes and be very formal? How large will the audience be? How large will the room be? How will it be lit? What equipment will be available for me to use? These are all issues of the space in which you are speaking. And the more you can know, the better you can prepare for delivering an effective, well-received presentation. Okay, so that's sort of like the people and the room. Now, depending on my purpose, whether, remember, to inform or to teach or to persuade or some combination of that, I want to think about what type of presentation I want to do, because we have several options available. So let's look at each one, remembering that it's all about your purpose and what you're trying to accomplish. So first of all, we have what we call the informative presentation, which your goal is to impartially, fairly, and accurately provide the best information you can about something. If that's your goal, you're not trying to persuade anybody of anything, you're not trying to get them to do anything, you just want them to know the information. If that's your goal, then for instance, you want the title of your presentation to be just clear and direct and factual. You tell your audience up front that your purpose is simply to provide information, nothing more. And you always acknowledge the sources of your information. Where did this information come from? So that your audience will have some faith in your credibility. Right? Another possible purpose for your oral presentation would be the training or instructional presentation. This, rather than simply provide information, is where you get to teach people how to do something, how to perform a task most often. Right? So you're training people to do something. If that's your purpose, to train people, to teach people how to do something, then your title clearly indicates your training purpose, how to do something, how to work this process. Whatever it is, your title should say, this is my purpose in being here. This is something I want to teach you or train you how to do. And once again, up front, the speaker tells the audience what the learning objectives are. In other words, when we are finished here, me being the speaker, when we are finished here, you will be able to do X. This is what you can expect to learn from this presentation I'm about to give you. All right? So you're really clear about the expectations of learning, or what we call learning objectives. And usually, as a part of these learning objectives, to aid people in learning what they need to learn, the speaker will often provide copies of the slides or other kinds of handouts that a listener can look at later, because the listeners are trying to remember now what they heard from you, and they're trying to replicate the process that you taught them how to do, or the task you taught them to perform. So they're trying to do it themselves, so it helps to have something to look at to remind them of what they heard. So often we'll use copies of slides or handouts to that effect. Now, if my purpose is not simply to inform or to teach, but it is actually to persuade someone to do something, to influence people's thinking, to gain their support, to change their opinions, then the speaker, first of all, up front, admits to promoting a particular point of view. So now I am not here simply to provide information. Now I am here to ask you to do something differently, to believe something that I'm telling you, to think in a different way. Right? And I admit that up front. In order to be credible, I do enough research to be well informed about the issue, and I use that research along with effective visuals to support any arguments that I make. So whatever position I take that I want you to either believe in or act upon, I have it backed up with good research and visuals that help support what I'm saying. And always thinks about beforehand and addresses counter arguments, positions that are different from mine, right? Different ways of approaching the issue than I am. And I prepare myself for challenging questions that will really get me to think about why my position or my argument is better than the other ones, is stronger, is more likely to make you happy and benefit you. Right? So I do that thinking ahead of time. What are the counter arguments and how do I address them? Another kind of oral presentation really sounds like and looks like an action plan. So usually a decision has already been made, or someone has already persuaded people to do something. So now the presentation is, what do we do? Here are the steps we need to take to get something done so that the listeners will take some action. So that's a particular kind of oral presentation that we do that's based on a decision already made, or that you've already persuaded. Now it's time to say what you need to do, what action you need to take. So once again, if that's what I'm about, then I, as a speaker, state my purpose up front. I present the research data to support the need for this plan. I mention other possible plans, but indicate that this is the one that's most effective. So it's just like any good argument. If there were other plans under consideration, I mention those, but then I describe and explain why the plan that I'm now going to put out to you is the most effective plan. And then I use my closing for that kind of oral presentation to restate what the audience should do. All right? So here's what needs to be done. Here's why it needs to be done. And summarize by saying, let's do it. This is what we need to do. Another related kind of presentation is the sales plan. And this is no punches pulled. You're trying to sell something. You're trying to sell something by informing your audience and persuading them at the same time. So this is one of those merged kinds of presentations that is both informing and persuading. The speaker, as always, researches thoroughly whatever the product is you're trying to sell, or the idea you're trying to sell, and then lets the facts themselves tell the story. So you don't have to, you're not persuading. The information that you got through your research is persuading. The facts tell your story for you. And then you can use examples to explain why this product or this service is the right one for you. Okay? That means that you as a speaker know your product well. You know this service well. And you know it just as well as, and you know it, and you know its competition, right? That's why part of telling the story is acknowledging that there might be other products or services that are similar that are competing for your attention. However, I have the best. In talking in that way, I need, as a speaker, to show that I have a sincere interest in the needs of my audience and in the concerns of my audience. That's one of the reasons why I acknowledge that there are other people out there trying to get your attention and trying to get your sale. But I care about you, and I think I know best what you need and what you're concerned about. And so here's what I think you should buy. Here's what I think you should do. And this kind of sales plan is especially important because you're trying to sell something to somebody, is that you provide a lot of time for people to ask their questions, to get their concerns and needs out on the table, to feel like they are being listened to by you, not just being sold something, but being listened to. All right? So provide lots of time for questions. All right, so those are different types of presentations. We also have some choices in types of delivery of an oral presentation. So let's look at some of those. Again, it's about your purpose, specifically about how you want to connect to your audience. What kind of connection to your audience will best serve your purpose in making this presentation? So, one way to do an oral presentation is by completely memorizing it beforehand. This is something you do not want to do in most cases. You don't want to make a memorized speech as an oral presentation. Especially in most workplaces, it is not going to work well. Why? Because it takes a long time to prepare. Think about how long it takes you to memorize just a little bit of information. and then multiply that by how much information you're going to be presenting in a technical delivery. So it would take a long time. Once you start to memorize something, you can't revise it, because if you revise it, you'll forget it. It won't work. You won't be able to memorize it. So you really can't revise once you start. Think about if you have memorized the presentation and you are now making it. If you feel like you're losing your audience, you have nowhere to go. You have to stick with what you memorized, unless you're really, really good on your feet and can just wing it and say something different than what you memorized. But that's very rare. Once you've memorized something, you're stuck with it. And if you should lose your place or stumble or somehow make a mistake, it's a disaster. You have nowhere to go. All you can do is try to remember where you lost your place. So it's really the least attractive of the kinds of oral delivery that are available to you. Now, having said that, if you want a more natural connection to your audience, there are some other options. One is to be impromptu. Now, impromptu means something very specific here. It means that you know your material dead on, and all you need to do is jot down a few notes. Now, notice I didn't say you memorized your material, but you know your material really, really well, so that all you need to do is now and then maybe refer to some notes you've made. But you don't need to read anything, you don't need to memorize anything. This also requires that you feel comfortable with your audience. If you feel nervous, if you feel unfamiliar, if you feel like you're in a foreign country, you do not want to do an impromptu presentation. Okay? You really do need to feel a good level of comfort. And you need to be sure, remember we talked about the speaking situation? You need to be sure that it's okay to take a more informal approach in this situation. If the situation calls for a formal presentation, you do not want to be impromptu. Okay? Also, you're not going to be impromptu if the information is highly complex. That's just too much for an impromptu presentation. So the content can't be too complex. It needs to be fairly simple. But if it is, then this sort of more natural, impromptu connection will work for you. But you need to know your stuff really well. Then there's, on the other side, is the scripted oral presentation, where you actually have a script and you're reading verbatim from that script. And this is the kind of presentation that you would most likely do when you're having to present a large number of details, or you're under a strict time limit where you have not very much time and a lot of information to convey, or you're nervous and you need the sort of crutch of the text. All right. Now, this might be something that you, for the presentations you're doing for this class, you might end up doing because you're basing your presentation on a written report. But be careful. You do not want to read from a long written report verbatim. You might want to read parts of it where you've got a lot of complex details. All right. But you really don't want to do a scripted presentation unless you absolutely have to for one or more of these reasons. Why? Why am I acting so hesitant about scripted presentations? Well, they are useful. They're useful for, as I said, complex technical material that needs to be presented. So perhaps if you are presenting a paper to a conference, or you're doing a formal speech, you use a script. But there are drawbacks to the script. And that is, there's very little interaction with your audience. If you are reading from a script, you are not making eye contact, you're not using gestures that invite your audience in. You're just not really interacting with your audience. And frankly, and I bet I don't need to tell you, that can be boring for your audience. You can lose your audience. It can be especially if you don't have like a really great speaking voice. It can just be boring. It can turn people off. Okay, so you just really have to be careful if you're not having that kind of interaction with your audience that you don't turn them off. And being able to do this requires a lot of prep time and rehearsal because you want to rehearse. If you are reading from a script, you better rehearse to time yourself and to make sure that what you're reading is what's actually written there. So, a lot of prep time and rehearsal. If that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. Then there's the extemporaneous oral presentation. This is the most natural connection to your audience. And yet, it feels very informal, yet it is carefully planned, and again, it is practiced in front of the mirror, right? It sounds like a conversation, but it's based on your deep knowledge and the notes you bring with you to keep you on track. It really focuses on your key ideas, which are often projected on a screen. So this is going to be a natural way to use visuals, is to have that PowerPoint up there with the key ideas that you are then elaborating on. Think about how instructors use PowerPoints in class. Think about our when you've had instructors who do a good job of using PowerPoint. The PowerPoint represents the key ideas, but a good instructor will elaborate on them and give you as much information to as context for them as possible. So that's what an extemporaneous speech allows you to do, is to elaborate on those key ideas, but have the key ideas right in front of your audience. Nevertheless, it is the most natural connection, but there are also dangers to the extemporaneous approach. And that is, heaven forbid, if you as a speaker lose track of your material. That's why you have those notes to sort of keep you in line, to keep you on track. If you go off on a tangent and you can't get back, that is a disaster. Same thing with the time limit. If you don't pay attention to the time limit, you lose track of it. You end up either having to run through things at the end because you're running out of time, or missing important information. And that relates to the next big danger, which is you actually forget something really important. Even if you had it in your notes, you forget to regularly check your notes and you end up forgetting some major piece of information. So both of those things can be really embarrassing and difficult and hard to take as the speaker, and your audience will know that something big is missing, or you've lost track, you've gone off, either your time or your material. Your audience will know. It would take a really, really skilled, confident speaker to cover up that kind of mistake. So those are the dangers of extemporaneous, but in that content, and given them, it is the best, the most, I don't know if I want to say the best, but it's certainly the most engaging way to connect with your audience. So, those are all your choices. You have to decide what kind of presentation you're going to do and what kind of delivery of your information you're going to do. All right? So, you've made your decisions. Now it's time to prepare. Always first is know your stuff. Do your research, summarize your evidence and your reasoning. Get your stuff clear. Now, hopefully you've done that already if you've done the written research report. Right? So you've done that clarifying of the information, of the evidence and your reasoning. But now for your oral presentation, you're going to boil it down to a few main, key, important points that you're going to project in your presentation. You're going to anticipate your audience's questions. whether it's about something new or something controversial, something that they might be disappointed by or surprised by. Think through at this stage what questions they are most likely to ask. And then make an outline. Intro, body, conclusion. Once again, if, as is true for you guys, this your oral report is going to be based on a written report, then the outline you made for that will work to shape your oral presentation as well. A little more about outlining, since it's an important way of organizing our thinking, especially in an oral presentation, is think about your introduction as the place where you set the stage. You get your listener's attention as you introduce the topic. So, what's a snappy way to get your audience's attention? Tell a story, ask a question, relate to something the audience cares about. As I think I've said this before to you, that audiences love to be brought in right away. So asking them a question that they actually have to answer is a great way to get them immediately on board with you. But also tell a moving story. Relate to a current or local event that you know the people are concerned about. Somehow your introduction starts with getting your listener's attention. Then you put out the issue, you explain where and how you got your information, you preview your main points and your overall recommendations. All right, so that introduction is critical to laying the groundwork, setting the stage. Then, if you've done a good job of that, then the body sort of works itself. And your job is to make it as easy to follow as possible. So small chunks of information at a time and good transitions from one chunk of information to the next. That's the kind of thing that will help your listeners stay with you. And that's your job, to make it clear and easy to follow. All right? And that's how you do it. Then your conclusion. Your conclusion always circles back to what you said at the beginning and pulls everything together. So you remind your listeners that there's a big picture here that we all care about. You restate your main points and your conclusions. You let the listeners know how to get information, more information, if they want it. If you've got handouts to distribute them now. But most important, you don't add anything new. All you're doing is wrapping up. And you wrap up by reminding, restating, saying goodbye with some forward-looking statement about how to learn more, or here's some information to help you remember on these handouts. Okay? Next piece of preparation, decide what visuals you're going to use, how many of them, and where to use them. And again, remember, we're trying to keep things simple and clear, so only use visuals that obviously will enhance and clarify what you are saying out loud. All right? So don't overuse them, and don't use things that people are going to scratch their heads about. These are supposed to be that I take one look and I get it kinds of graphics. So what kinds of graphics will do that given the kind of information I'm presenting? Charts, graphs, illustrations, diagrams. These may come from your written report also, but make sure they're highly visible and highly explanatory, so I don't have any question about why you're flashing that picture up there. How complex or how simple? Simpler the better, I say. How can we use technology to prepare them? Are we just doing PowerPoint slides, or are there other kinds of technology that we can use to prepare them? Should we use presentation software? Where will showing be more effective than telling? Right? These are the kinds of decisions that you need to make. So you've made all the decisions, you put together your presentation, and then you rehearse as many times as possible. Especially if you're doing it in a group, You absolutely must rehearse together so that there's no overlap or no contradiction of each other. Heaven forbid. Okay? Here's something that is a really good idea. Remember, we talked about the speaking situation. If you have the opportunity to do so, go and look at the space you'll be speaking in before you speak. Look at it. Look at what it looks like. What's the space like? How is it organized? Are there outlets to plug things in? How are the tables set up? What's the lighting like? Do I want to dim the lights or do I want them brighter? Do I need a microphone? Where is it? How do I make it work? Will I want to use flip charts and markers? Where can I set them up so that everybody can see them? The physical space is a really important part of your oral presentation and can really contribute to its quality if you use it well. But first you have to know it. So check it out beforehand. Don't get there right before you're speaking and find that you can't figure out where to plug in your PowerPoint presentation. It just drives you crazy and makes the audience uncomfortable. So prepare if you possibly can by knowing the space beforehand. And also, if possible, knowing the audience beforehand, getting to know them a little bit, building relationships a little bit before you have to speak to them for whatever purpose you're speaking to them. If it's possible, try to meet some of them beforehand, just to say hello, just to gain some level of comfort with the people you're going to be speaking to. Then, once you are speaking, think about your tone of voice. What you want to do is you want to come across like a confident, reasonable, enthusiastic, nice person. So what does it sound like? And what does it look like when somebody's being reasonable and confident and enthusiastic? Well, you use natural movements. You stand in a comfortable way, a way that shows that your body is comfortable. Okay? You adjust the volume of your voice and the speed of your talking so that your audience can understand you. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with asking, can everybody hear me? Is the rate, how fast I'm talking, okay? Need me to slow down at all? In fact, again, that might be a good thing. Ask them as a way to engage them and show that you care, that they can hear you. All right? If you're using a microphone and you're not used to using a microphone, practice beforehand. It is a skill. It doesn't come easily to people who haven't done it before. So if you know you have to use a microphone and you're not feeling comfortable, try to get a chance to practice with a microphone beforehand. And in your practice, know that people tend to speak faster when they're nervous. And if that's the case, we need to consciously slow down. All right? So if you know yourself and you know you're going to be nervous, you can bet that you'll speak faster than normal. So practice slowing down. All right? Make and keep eye contact if humanly possible, even before you start actually speaking, with as many of your listeners as possible. Now again, if you are reading from a script, that's not going to be possible, and you're going to lose the impact that eye contact can make. You're also going to lose the ability to see people's responses as they have them. And this is really an important argument for doing a more extemporaneous kind of speaking. Because if you don't know how your listeners are responding, you won't be able to adjust your presentation if you need to. So if people are fidgeting, they're frowning, they're looking confused, they're looking upset, they're murmuring to each other or mumbling things, they're falling asleep, you're not doing your job very well, and you need to adjust. But you don't know that if you aren't looking, if you aren't able to get out of that script long enough to see what's going on in the room. So it really does strengthen your presentation to be able to look around and see make eye contact, and see how people are responding to what you're saying. And so, what kind of adjustments might you have to make? Well, maybe what's going on here is there's just too much information. It's like people are getting an overload. If you sense that from the way people are reacting, then stop saying everything and summarize what you've got. Or if people are getting that look on their faces that says, I am so lost, I don't know what you're talking about. If people are confused, go back and give an example or give some further information so that people can get clear on what you're saying. Takes a good attentive speaker to do this, but you can do it. Try to keep things running smoothly. That's what, you don't want big surprises to disrupt your audience. So say what you came to say, summarize what you said, and close. Be polite and keep to your allotted time. Before you end, always summarize your major points, re-emphasize anything of special importance, and thank your listeners for listening. Just a nice send away of your folks. That in some ways, I said in some ways the introduction is the most important piece. If you get that right, the body works a lot better. Well, the closing is pretty important too, simply because it reiterates what you did in the introduction. You want to send people away remembering what your major points were and what was especially important. And send them away feeling good that you thanked them for being there and for paying attention. And as we said before, always leave time at the end for questions. Be sure to tell the audience at the very beginning of your presentation that there will be time for questions, especially if you don't want them interrupting your presentation with questions. So always leave time at the end. All right?